Good evening and welcome to News from Neptune for the 23rd week of 2018. I'm Carl Estabrook. Back from vacation with thanks to Oliver Stone for filling in for us while we were gone. His USA History series on YouTube is available on YouTube. And if you saw the program last week, you saw an introduction to what he has done. I recommend it highly. For almost 30 years, News from Neptune has been a weekly hour of spontaneous and unrehearsed discussion of the news of the week and its coverage by the media, first on a so-called community radio station, and now via Urbana Public TV and YouTube. Earlier editions of this program are available at archive.org. Our program's name, News from Neptune, comes from Noam Chomsky, who's been writing sensible things about U.S. politics for twice as long as we've been on the air. Chomsky says that in the U.S. media, either you repeat the same conventional doctrines everybody is saying, or else you say something true, and it will sound like it's from Neptune. Tonight, David Green and I will try to say some true things, with thanks to Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, for research. No's notes are posted on the News from Neptune Facebook page. We try to bear in mind the murdered Rosa Luxemburg's remark from a century ago. The most revolutionary thing one can do is always to proclaim loudly what is happening. This is a summer vacation edition of News from Neptune. We're concluding a certain summer vacation, but the rest of the world seems to be taking various forms of summer vacation, notably political leaders who are going to conferences around the world, some of which may actually have some effect. We'll start tonight with David Green.
So the year 2018, of course, is a year of much talk about 50 years ago, 1968. And this week, the talk was about the assassination of Robert F. Kennedy during this week in 1968. Not a whole lot I found that I read in the New York Times or the New Yorker or in perhaps a couple of other places particularly edifying about RFK and what his role was on the American political scene in the 1960s. I would say, and of course at that time I was pretty much wrapped up in him and that sort of thing, but in retrospect it would appear that it unfortunately hasn't made a whole lot of difference in the past 50 years, politically speaking, as to whether RFK had lived and had become president in 1969 rather than, say, Richard Nixon, who did become president. And of course, there's a lively industry in speculating about such things. But what I read this week in terms of Kennedy as kind of the last liberal, the last hope of the survival of sort of the New Deal Democratic Party, doesn't seem right to me. It's fun to read in some ways, but it doesn't seem right to me. And another, what was brought to mind on the Counterpunch website this morning, not a 50th anniversary, but a 51st one, which is the bombing of the USS Liberty, summarized in an article by Jeffrey St. Clair, which was in a book several years ago, which was in an anthology several years ago. But he reprinted a version of that article on Counterpunch this morning, reminding us that when governments lie, boy, they can lie big time. And that has been a big lie, the whole cover-up for that. I mean, you can't even hardly call it that anymore, because anybody who wants to know it, aside from conspiratorial views of JFK's killing or RFK's killing, which was something I didn't even know about until the past week. I mean, what happened with the USS Liberty and Israel's bombing of it in June of 1967 it is perfectly clear, as were the skies that day, when Israel could very well see that they were bombing an American vessel. But that's worth reading if you haven't read
Yep.
about that. Certainly, Jeffrey St. Clair's article is worth reading, and again, reminding us of how baldly the U.S. government and the Israeli government can lie about such things. I guess you might say there's been a modified, limited hangout in some aspects of that, but certainly nothing like the accounting that should have happened both then or since then. Three more brief notes. I wouldn't have thought, given the absence of Charles Krauthammer's column from the News Gazette on Friday, I wouldn't have thought that they could have found a more lunatic columnist to take his place. But a fellow, which I mentioned on this program before, Mark Thiessen, this morning really went over the top with his article entitled "Google Should Support U.S. Military." Thiessen is a former speechwriter. Just to give you an idea how you move into the punditry business, first you become a speechwriter for Donald Rumsfeld in the early 2000s during the George Bush era. Then you become a speechwriter for George Bush, his own self, and then you go on to the Washington Post with the sort of bald-faced neocon attitude about the U.S. military and how the people in Silicon Valley are sitting with their feet up and having massages while getting massages at work while the U.S. military is defending their freedoms. Put in a bad word for J.B. Pritzker, if you don't mind.
Not a bad idea at
I don't know
all.
if you watch the same things I do, but I see a lot of ads over and over again. There's a couple of ads out for J.B. Pritzker.
For governor of Illinois.
For governor of the state, yes. And, he's being sold as someone who cares about early childhood care, which is fine, but him saying that he used his own leverage as a born into wealth person to aid early childhood education and meal programs and so forth really isn't to me the way to go about dealing with issues of poverty in this state. One other ad that he's had that I've only seen a couple of times has to do with a black woman thanking J.B. Pritzker for helping to feed her children, her evidently poor children, breakfast, so that because they were in the words of the ad, her children are her most important investment. And I realize that language is used loosely, and we invest in things, and it isn't always reduced to a capitalistic word. But the idea that we invest in our children, that's fine. It's our government. If you want to use that kind of language, it's our government and our social system that should be investing in them, and not assuring that we have a system in which a third to a half of them are going to end up being poor, are going to start out being poor, and then most of those are going to end up being poor. I don't think J.B. Pritzker is really offering a clear alternative to the new and improved Ronner. It sounds like Ronner's running on the idea that he wants to play ball, and J.B. Pritzker will play ball too. So, and then one final note just on the monthly issue. You could do this any month, but for some reason this month there were several articles in response to the latest report, the latest Labor Department report about the jobs program, the unemployment, or the jobs situation, the unemployment level, and all of which, there's no reason denying that our economy, our cyclical capitalist economy, is on a mild upswing now, and that there are a few more people working, a marginal amount in terms of percentage of the workforce that are working. But we're reminded by several commenters. One is on Counterpunch this morning, a guy named Pete Dolak, who does a good job of summarizing what the response should be. Also, Bob Pollin had an article somewhere, I think Truthdig, about that. And it's clear that life is not getting better for the working class in this country for any number of reasons that have nothing to do with these general figures about how many people are in the wage labor force. It has to do with how much they're getting paid. It has to do with the temporary nature of their work. And that word temporary can be used extremely broadly in terms of the way people are working these days. Not just people who get jobs through temporary agencies. I mean, it's much broader than that in terms of the people, the sort of insecure workers, the precariat, so-called. And so capitalism is capitalism. Thomas Edsall in the New York Times did a reasonable job of explaining what the war on labor, how the war on labor unions has gone over the last few decades, and especially recently, and how labor is somewhat fighting back, and the court decisions and so forth, and of course the upcoming court decision, the Janus decision based in the being argued in the Supreme Court is going to be an important decision in terms of public employee unions. But the history of American labor in capitalism is that it rises and it falls. It wins a little bit for a while, but then it ultimately loses because we have an extremely vicious capitalist class in this country. And under this system, labor unions are not going to do well unless, except under very compromised circumstances. So we need to keep that in mind while we're dealing with all this data and whatever minor positive things that we can say about people's near-term fortunes.
Thank you, David. You're watching News from Neptune, and we are referring particularly today to our friends at Counterpunch, the website and the printed version as well. The editor, Jeffrey Sinclair, is a friend of this ground. We don't always agree with Jeffrey. Well, we don't always agree with one another, so I mean, why should you be surprised? But Jeffrey has, for years, edited what seems to me the premier political website available to us. He often prints things that he doesn't quite agree with, as well as printing things that we don't quite agree with. But it's still head and shoulders above everybody else who's in that business, as far as I can tell.
And even in this article about the USS Liberty, he raises the issue of the Israel lobby, and assuming that it's the power of the Israel lobby that has prevented the revealing what really happened and accounting for what really happened. And we could bat that back and forth and talk about the ins and outs of that. But as a basic statement, it doesn't strike me as being right, as being the way to kind of lead his article.
I agree with that. We've talked about this a good bit here, and
our audience is probably just bored to death with it by now.
On the contrary, it's important, and that's worthwhile to keep that issue going, because the attitudes towards it come from a variety of different perspectives. I've been involved in a email contretemps with a number of other people in this town who are working on anti-war and related issues over what we have almost jocularly called the higher anti-Semitism, the view that the American political crimes in the world can be exculpated by the fact that they're being dictated from Israel. The higher anti-Semitism is the Jews made us do it. I think that, in fact, is nonsense, that Israel is a client state of the United States for all the very real influence the government of Israel and its sympathizers exercise in the U.S. But the passions on the matter run high, and to try to sort out the sorts of things that are going on and whose interests are being served by them, this is very difficult. And the 51-year-old Liberty atrocity shows that once again, it seems to me. Comments on a number of the things that you've mentioned, David. I was privileged to know slightly the late I.F. Stone, who was maybe one of the first people. He ran a print newsletter in the 1960s that is comparable in some sense to what Sinclair and his colleagues do at Counterpunch. The technology has changed, but the attempt to write an accurate and non-mainstream news account continues, and I think Counterpunch can be a legitimate descendant of I.F. Stone's Weekly. Of course, if we put the two men in the same room, they'd probably argue too. One of Izzy Stone's observations, in some ways the premier observation from his years of trying to give good accounts of what the American government was doing. He was in fact banned from news conferences in the 60s because he was doing that. His observation was, quote, all governments lie, and that his job was to expose those lies. He did that through the Vietnam War. A lot of people who came to understand what the Vietnam War was in the 60s did so because Izzy Stone was writing about it. One of the very few people who was doing that. So it's a tradition that's worthwhile keeping up, and it's worthwhile remembering Stone's watchword, all governments lie. This excrescence in the News Gazette today is all you describe it as. It's just incredible. This guy, Thiessen, he's not teasing, I'm afraid, takes off from a letter from Google employees. In their letter, the employees said that working with the Pentagon would violate Google's longtime motto, don't be evil, and, quote, irreparably damage Google's brand, close quote. Thiessen writes, excuse me? Are they saying that the U.S. military is evil? Damn straight. That's exactly what they're saying, and they're quite right. This is the military, remember, that since the Second World War has killed between 20 and 30 million people around the world. Take Mr. Thiessen's question and pose it to the rest of the world. You won't have any trouble getting an answer, and the answer will be yes. The military that is carrying on 8 wars around the world in the Obama and Trump administrations, the military that destroyed a third of North Korea in the 1950s, the military that committed the greatest post-war crime in the world, in the 4 million people it killed in Southeast Asia. This military, which committed these crimes not to defend freedom or to defend anyone under attack, this military which committed these crimes to defend the economic empire that the U.S. established after the Second World War, is evil. That's exactly right. The rest of the world sees that, but Americans, the objects, subjects, I suppose, of the most effective propaganda system in the world, don't know that. And obviously, Mr. Thiessen doesn't either when he suggests that it's absolutely foolish to suggest that the U.S. military is evil. The insightful employees of Google understand very much what their company is doing, and it led them to make the protest, which produces Thiessen's outrage. More power to the employees at Google.
The only thing Thiessen's missing is he didn't go to an Ivy League school for some reason. He went to Vassar. So I don't know what's up with Vassar.
That's a necessary or sufficient, if not necessary, condition. I don't. Let's see, Thiessen. The new, there's a new editorial board at the News Gazette.
There is.
And
there's a different tone in the paper. Not that not that it was anything to write home about before. But
I-
what is your observation?
I'm not sure that the tone is different. I haven't seen.
Yeah.
I don't know.
Yeah.
I do know that they are running notes from peculiar people like you and me. So something.
Yeah.
But the situation is such that people get their news frequently these days only from sources they already agree with.
Yeah.
I've thought for a while that here in Champaign-Urbana, one of the few places where absolutely contradictory, opposed, or varying political opinions showed up side by side was in the letters column of the News Gazette.
Yeah.
Not because of the enlightened editorial policy of the News Gazette, nor of their enlightened policy on producing columnists, except for you and me,
Yeah.
and
Some of our friends.
and some of our friends. But the fact of
Or
the matter
even
is,
those that are still our friends, I should say.
the point is that they show up how narrow most of our news sources are in the present situation by posting letters that disagree with one another. More power to them.
Yeah, but I mean, the basic overriding continuity in the sort of both the explicit and implicit News Gazette editorial policy is that governments ought not to spend so much money on things that actually help people, especially state government.
But remember,
and taxes are too damn high. That's it. Taxes are too damn high, especially for rich people.
What's at stake here is the unassailable principles of neoliberalism, which form the bedrock of the political positions of both of our, quote, major, close quote, political parties, and therefore most of our media as well. It's not a surprise, but it's worthwhile to mention in order to oppose. That's our job, for one thing, and a lot of other people's job as well. I do have a letter sitting in the inbox of the News Gazette right now, which solves the state budget problem, by the way.
The new managing editor who does letters now, David Burleson, actually, whereas the old one had a once a month policy, he would kind of publish something after maybe 3 weeks or so if you send it in. Apparently, if he didn't have anything else, he would be flexible. But this new guy, he's a 30-day man. I mean, it's like those 30 days have to go by, and you're not going to get another one in. So just to give you a heads up on that.
That's why my letter is sitting in the inbox.
That's probably the most meaningful change that's happened.
That's probably why the letter is sitting in the inbox of the News Gazette, because in fact, my letter contains a solution to the state budget problem, which has been discussed in various ways in the News Gazette, and a couple of recent columns by Jim Dye talk about the supposed compromise on the budget that has emerged from the legislature just this week. The point is that the Constitution of the state of Illinois calls for a balanced budget. And so, as Jim Dye delights in pointing out, this causes various intellectual stretching exercises, to put no finer point on it, by the legislature to show how its budget is balanced. The point of my letter is that it would be perfectly reasonable to balance the budget and not change the tax structure of the state of Illinois at all. Not that it couldn't be improved, of course it could, but you wouldn't have to change the tax structure, as those people who talk about a progressive income tax want to, and you could still, in fact, produce that balanced budget if you instituted one reform sketched years ago by James Tobin of the Yale economics faculty. This is a so-called Tobin tax, a financial transactions tax, that is to say, a sales tax on the buying and selling of financial instruments like security. The state of Illinois contains two of the largest financial markets in the world, centered in Chicago, centered in fact on LaSalle Street in Chicago, and hence the tax is often referred to as a LaSalle Street tax. It is a tiny tax per incident, a tiny sales tax on the buying and selling of financial instruments. And it would produce, by some estimates, $10 billion for the state of Illinois to cover all of its various concerns, or at least most of it. The Chicago Teachers Union has worked for a while pointing out the beauties of this system, and there has been a bill in the legislature to establish a financial transactions tax for a while. Why hasn't it happened? The answer is pretty clear. It taxes rich people. I don't know how many financial instruments you've disposed of this month, one way or another. I haven't done too many. I don't know about David. Maybe David had. But the point is that the people who would pay that financial transaction tax, and as I say, it works out to a tiny percentage, much less than you pay for sales tax when you go to buy shoes, for example. If you put a tax of that level on financial transactions, you would probably be able to settle the national debt overnight. But this tiny tax on financial transactions would solve Illinois' budget problem, but neither party backs it. Why? Rich people. Rich people. They don't want to offend the rich people, and therefore they don't do the obvious solution for Illinois budget problem.
J.B. Pritzker, in one of the ads I was referring to, he's asked what advice or what advice he has or what something, and he says, for living daily life, and he said, be grateful. And I mean, I don't know how they. I mean, there's a tone. There's a tone deafness about a wealthy heir to a fortune being grateful. Yes, I'm all about gratitude, but not in that context. It strikes me as a lot of people might not take that in the right way. The other thing, just a couple comments. They could also do this Tobin tax at the national level, which means there would be less chance that they would just move their operations to some other state to avoid taxes in this state. But the even broader statement should be that local governments, austerity has been imposed on state and local governments through basically federal policies, or the lack of federal policies, which used to accord much better funding to the state and local levels. And in that context, it's important to note that it's the federal government that needs to be doing this, because it's the federal government that can print money. State governments can't print money. So it's a kind of a false crisis. It's a phony crisis in the sense that you can say that states have to balance budgets, but the federal government doesn't have to balance its budget, and in fact, it shouldn't. It should be printing money to put people to work, and it's for lack of that Jim Dye can be a sort of green eye shade guy, reminding us on how many hundreds of millions of dollars or billions of dollars where the state budget is out of whack.
We should point out that Mr. Dye, the premier investigative reporter on the News Gazette and one of the most interesting writers, I think, for it, other than David and me, of course, is welcome to join us at any point and comment on our comments on his comments. So these things go on. One point about, on the notion that a financial transaction tax, while solving the state's problem, should in fact be imposed at a federal level. Yes, that's exactly right. And it's parallel to some other things in which states have actually begun to take the lead on things that the federal government should be doing. Healthcare is the most interesting example. States from Hawaii to Vermont have worked on various forms of single-payer healthcare, some successfully, some not, but they've moved in that direction as a model for what the federal government should be doing. Remember that single-payer health care the equivalent of Medicare for all, came to Canada because of the work of one man in one province, the equivalent of a state, in Canada, and moved from that to all of Canada. This was almost 3 generations ago, and as a result, Canada has a national health care system that grew from the bottom up. In a well-run universe, we should be able to do the same thing, begin this at the Illinois level. Banking is another area. The regulations on banking could be improved remarkably from the bottom up, starting at the state level. The State Bank of North Dakota is an example. The notion that states are merely administrative districts of the federal government, although certainly has been encouraged by, in some ways, literally for generations, is not necessary. I mean, there are things that can be started as initiatives at this level, and a financial transaction tax, health care, banking reform, these are things that we should be doing at the state level. Unfortunately, what we have at the state level are parties which are legislators, which are run by the major parties, as we say, and therefore no such thing occurs. We should remind them about it.
But of course, Carl, again, while I'm trying to watch sports, which is basically the only thing I watch on sort of regular television, Wells Fargo keeps telling me that they're so sorry.
Yeah.
They're so sorry for all the criminal activity they knowingly engaged in for years. Yeah. All the tens of thousands of people that were built out of their money. They are so sorry, and they're starting all over, and we forgive you, Wells Fargo. And that, anyway.
Poor Al Capone never had that chance, did he? Tell us how sorry he was and how he was starting over. But, there's another point along that line.
Just one thing while I'm thinking of it.
Oh, yes.
It's in terms of single-payer health care starting at the state level, there's word now that California may revive its effort to do that, which they did under Schwarzenegger, but Schwarzenegger vetoed it. So they're looking forward to this new governor, who will probably be this guy, Gavin Newsom, who has been mayor of San Francisco. And, I don't trust Gavin Newsom. I don't trust the Democratic Party. I don't trust Democratic Party politics in California in terms of that it really means anything, that people can really hang their hat on. People are telling us that we should. People are talking, and they're running numbers, and they're looking at all these races in this strange primary system they have where it's everybody gets put in the same pool and 2 people come out, and and so
cage match.
I've been following that a little bit, but Gavin Newsom claims this attractive governor that is always surrounded by beautiful women. I don't know what's up with that all the time, but he's saying he's for single payer, or he's being marketed as being for single payer. So we will find out. We will probably find out in the next year or 2 what that means as he becomes governor, how they're going to back down from that, how they're going to decide that it's probably not time. But again, it's the California Nurses Union that has been the primary advocates for that. And just to put it and get worse, since I put in a kind of a negative word for the potential of unions, that's what the potential of unions is. Our friend David Johnson always stresses that they should be advocating, of course, not just for their own issues, but for these larger programs that change the kind of social structure that is needed.
Well, and the potential for unions is an interestingly complex question. Another Canadian example, when national health care, Medicare for all, as I say, single payer, call it what you will, came to Canada. As I say, it came from the political lower level to the higher level, the province to the national level. But the unions took an interesting position on it. Unlike American unions, which worked on health care for its members, the Canadian unions supported the attempt at a national health care so that you didn't have to be a member of a union to receive your health care. You were a citizen who received health care. Now, that's a real difference between what happened in this country, you know, where so many people are locked into their current jobs because their union provides their health care. The relationship of unions to social progress is often a questionable matter. The most interesting example of that recently has been the enthusiasm, which surprises even me, who was interested in it from early on, for a universal basic income. There are the strangest people turning up, speaking up for a universal basic income at the level of a living wage, that you receive money you need to live simply because you live as a citizen of the country. An excellent idea, an idea that's being challenged, that's being proposed in various ways by various people, some people who consider themselves conservatives, some people who consider themselves progressives, but the idea itself is progressing, and this is really quite surprising. Unions are in a peculiar position here. The union power rests in some sense on what it can do to raise your wages, to give you a living wage. The union power is in a certain sense undercut by a universal basic income, and that's the reason that a good number of union groups oppose it. Oppose it because it deprives them of the benefit that they claim to be achieving for their members, that is, a living wage. So there is a fight here waiting to happen. If we were having a serious political discussion in this country, it would be near the top of the list, I think. But the question of the unions and what of American unions and what American unions are actually doing is at least ambiguous. Keep your eye on it, and keep your eye on the arguments for a universal basic income. One other comment about this. Oh, yes. Talking about the financial transaction tax. During the Democratic primary in the state, there was in fact one candidate, Daniel Biss, who spoke up for that. He lost. The well-heeled Mr. Pritzker ended up as the Democratic nominee for governor. But I was interested to see that Daniel Biss, who had spoken about the benefits of a financial transaction tax in solving the state's problems, endorsed Pritzker. Now, whether that means that there's any chance that a Pritzker governorship would consider supporting such a matter or not, I'm hesitant to say. I don't think there's any real chance of it, but it's possible. That's where the idea
He'd
went.
be making a lot of his friends pretty unhappy if he did so. His close friends pretty
Exactly.
unhappy if he did so.
Exactly right.
But
You're watching News from Neptune. We have a good number of things on the table here. There's one theme that I want to mention, David, you and I have disagreed to some extent on, but there's been developments.
let's have it out.
Beg pardon?
Let's have it out.
Well, no, I just mean there have been some interesting developments since since we last sat together on this issue.
I don't even know what you're talking about yet, but I'll be interested to find out.
I'm talking about the Italian government.
Oh, the Italians.
The
of
Italian.
course.
I'm talking about
we disagree about the Italians.
Exactly. Populism. Populism is.
Oh, right. Okay.
And you have you've suggested that my enthusiasm for the populist wave in Europe and elsewhere may have gone to my head. I may be overstated. I may lead me to blink
Not
at
so
some.
much popular. I think what I was doing, I'm not sure if this is what you're referring to, but nationalism is that some of the reading I was doing, especially about nationalism in the Israeli context, just caused me to believe that there's so much, Shlomo Sand and the whole thing about Jewish nationalism and the Jewish nation and the Jewish state and where it come from. It occurred to me at a certain point in time that nationalism, of course, populism is also used in different ways, and we're trying to use it in a more consistent, meaning democratic way on this program, and I'm fine with that. It's national. nationalism that is becoming one of those words like fascism that doesn't seem to have a clear meaning anymore.
I think that's exactly right. In fact, I think...
Or not that it ever did, but...
Well, I think it's worthwhile to try to unpack it.
Yes.
I mean, nationalism as a political concept goes back at least to the French Revolution. It's not clear to me that before the Treaty of Westphalia or before even the French Revolution, one can speak of nationalism precisely in a continuity with what we want to say here. I mean, it requires the construction of a capitalist state for nationalism to make sense. A pre-capitalist state, the states, say, of the late medieval monarchies and so forth, have a little trouble applying consistently the word nationalist into what they do. If you think of the King's speech in Henry V before the Battle of Crécy, the appeal to those the king is calling for to enter once more into the breach, dear friends, is on the basis of loyalty to himself, the king, and to the English political, we would call political system, but it's not exactly a nationalist assertion. Nationalism waits for capitalism. It's only the capitalist state that begins to try to use the identity of the nation, that is the people. The word nation is rooted in the notion of being born, the place where you were born. It's only capitalism that uses nationalism to try to rally people in favor of a state which really doesn't command their interests. The workers who are summoned to the nationalist enthusiasm for the capitalist state are being misled, are being hoodwinked. And we see this growing throughout the 19th century and into the 20th. Now, the problem gets worse in recent discussion because economic nationalism has been contrasted with corporate globalism in a different way. Corporate globalism refers to the neoliberal policies which redound to the to the profit of the 1%. Corporate globalism is an economic organization is an organization of the world's economy that supports the economic elite, particularly the economic elite in this country. Corporate globalism is contrasted with economic nationalism, which is said to be a concern for the economic well-being of the majority in the country. And it's not wrong to say that what made Donald Trump president was the excitation of economic nationalism amongst the voters who thought that what would happen from a Trump administration would be an improvement of their economic condition. And the people understood, rightly, that this would be in contrast with the corporate globalism practiced by previous administrations, notably the Obama administration, for the previous 40 years, which redounded to the profit of the elite.
Yeah.
So it seems to me that we have a long-term history of the word nationalism now repristinated, so to speak, in contemporary debate.
Yeah, no, I agree. I mean, I was going to, the next thing I was going to say was what you already said, was that it's what made Trump president. It's economic nationalism,
right,
however understood, however meant, and however understood.
And however badly practiced, too.
Yeah, made Trump president.
Right.
And what's going on, and there's one fundamental issue regarding all this, in very practical terms, that's played itself out in Europe over the past few years, obviously, has to do with the role of the euro, the role of I guess called a supranational currency or a collective state currency, controlled mainly by Germany, in terms of the euro, and whether economic nationalism in the Italian case means that you leave the euro and adopt your own currency.
That's
We
right.
went through the same thing, but with Greece a few years ago,
Exactly.
a couple of years ago, all the debates about whether it was possible and practical and feasible, and what sort of suffering would be involved in, and how difficult it would be to leave the euro. And now these same debates are resurfacing in the context, in the Italian context, and some of the same people on either side are arguing, including, for instance, I think, if I've got this right, Eve Smith, the Naked Capitalism person,
Author.
She has always dismissed the possibility or the practicality of countries leaving the euro, just like she was opposed to Brexit. And now again,
Yes. Yes, exactly, and for some of the same reasons.
Yeah, and other people saying, well, there's a certain amount of suffering involved, whether it be Italy or Greece or Britain, in terms of Britain has retained its own currency, but so leaving the European Union is a somewhat different issue in terms of trade and so forth, and all the aspects of the way the European countries relate to each other. But all these same things are happening in Italy, and it's kind of hard for a layperson to know with some of these technical arguments whether they really should support leaving the euro. But I just don't know what other way countries are going to be able to, for better or worse, at least have their own people be able to control their own economic destiny in any sort of context, even if they become poor. But at least they become poor, but they can have policies that deal with that, which the European Union and the euro don't really allow them to do even that.
And the possibility of that happening so scared the neoliberal authorities in Europe and the U.S., I might say, that the Italian president took the unprecedented step of destroying a government that had been elected in the March election in Italy. He broke up the alliance between the Lega, the Northern League in Italy, and the Five Star Movement that had produced a government, that is, a group of ministers and so forth, to run the institutions of the country. He destroyed that, and the outcry in Italy was so great that he had to back off just a bit. Not a lot. The fundamental issue, not the specific issue on which the president of Italy destroyed the elected government, was decided in his favor, but the response was the establishment of a government which excluded the two main parties, the equivalent of the Republicans and the Democrats, and used these fringe parties, as they were called. The fringe parties outvoted the centrist parties, of course, in a coalition which produced a government that we could call economic nationalist in its principles. They've talked even of a universal basic income, a government that refused to take orders from the neoliberals in Brussels and the neoliberals in Washington. For the moment, at least, they're refusing to take those orders on everything from the universal basic income to relationships to the sanctions on Russia. This is important. You're drawing the parallel with Greece is quite right, but the Greek government did not have the force that the Italian state has behind its government, and it's also another step in a movement which was indeed pioneered and then abandoned by Syriza in Greece. So the formation of a coalition government in Italy a coalition government that is economic nationalist in the terms that we have been speaking is causing the lights to burn late in Foggy Bottom in Washington and in Brussels. They're worried about this, quite worried. And since this is bound up with the other issues that are threatening the control of the American empire, we can only applaud. The term economic nationalism that we've been using tonight is parallel in a certain way to the term populism, and it would be worthwhile if we would get away from sterile discussions of left and right and whatnot, and perhaps talk about these movements, which are real, new, and important in these terms. The best single book on the populist wave of the 21st century that I know of describes populism as an ideology that pits a virtuous and homogeneous people against a set of elites and dangerous others who are together depicted as depriving or attempting to deprive the sovereign people of their rights, values, prosperity, identity, and voice. It's sweeping, but I think it's right. I think that's when we talk about populism, it is at once as vague as that and as powerful as that in terms of a mood that is producing governments, as it has in these last weeks in Italy. We're looking at something important. And I want to suggest that what we're talking about here is parallel to the movement that produced Brexit in Britain, the Sanders campaign and the Trump campaign here, the Le Pen campaign and the Mélenchon campaign in France, the
Corbyn.
I was trying to find a way to introduce what I knew was going to be David's objection, which is the governments in Hungary and Poland. I'm sorry, Corbyn. No, you said Corbyn. I thought you.
Orban.
Orban. I thought.
Corbyn.
I was so scared of David's reaction that I heard it before he actually said it.
I wasn't even thinking of Hungary and Poland.
Oh, of course.
I don't know why, but no, because
Corbyn is absolutely right.
What I was thinking of is, but whenever you try to phrase things, you use words, and words have ambiguous meanings in general, especially in political context. So when you throw a word out like homogeneous, it's like people are going to say, well, what do you mean, like Italians for Italians? What about immigrants? What about multiculturalism?
Well,
is this what you're talking about? And I guess one response to that, and maybe it's a little bit of a contrived response, but I think it's worth saying. Homogeneous means the working class.
Yes, exactly.
That's what we're talking about.
That's right.
I mean, people probably ought not to. Probably ought to be careful about using that word homogeneous, but it's not. It's because of the connotations in terms of racism and ethnic purity that have been associated with nationalism, with a certain kind of nationalism in the past.
One of the interesting keys to the terminological inexactitude that is so exercising David and me at the moment is the behavior of the Marxist-Leninist sects. Now, he said that carefully, S-E-C-T-S. I don't care about their. In any case, there are a good number of intelligent people, perfectly intelligent people, associated with what they see as the Marxist-Leninist tradition, and when they encounter this populist wave in Europe and America, can see only a departure from the virtuous progress of the working class. Populism is seen as an enemy of the working class. It must be right-wing because it's not left-wing. It's not Marxist-Leninist. I think this is hidebound thinking. But the sorts of issues that need to be taken up there call on us to clean up the language, to define these terms more clearly, and calls upon the Marxist-Leninists to the Marxist-Leninist groups to think outside the box. I hate myself for saying that. The box being
I hate you too.
so do they, even more. The box being the traditional Marxist-Leninist, the hidebound Marxist-Leninist categories have been received as they have been received from an earlier period. Not all of them, but I'm shocked when I see things like the World Socialist website saying whatever this government in Italy is, it's a right-wing government, and therefore we've got to organize the working class against it. I think that's a serious mistake, and it's a mistake that comes from hidebound thinking.
Yeah. Just one more point that I've been wanting to sort of get off my chest, and it fits into this. What we need to keep our eye on the ball of the ultimate hypocrisy of liberals and the power structure and the ruling class who talk about authoritarianism, who throw around words in response to Trump and to Sanders and to other aspects, throw around words like authoritarianism and tyranny and so forth to describe Russia, and then on the other hand present themselves in the context of, say, the European Union is saying, well, this is really about people getting along with each other and trading with each other and crossing borders and so forth, and multiculturalism. But it's important to say that the European Union, I mean, aside from our own government and its global dominance, the European Union is being run by bankers. It's a tyranny.
Yes.
It's an authoritarian tyranny being run by bankers. And they're upset because people are saying they don't want to live in an authoritarian tyranny being run by bankers. And they're calling themselves economic nationalists or populists, or they're calling themselves right or left or whatever.
Very good. This is quite right. That's what I've been trying to say for the last half hour. Thank you. David got it in a couple of sentences.
Okay.
That was very good. We have a few minutes left, and I would like to turn to one thing, talk about someone else we've criticized on this program. That is Democracy Now!, the program, the daily news and commentary program. They had Kathy Kelly on the program this morning. Kathy Kelly is a friend of this ground, one of the 10 people that keeps God from destroying the universe. She is head of Voices of Creative Nonviolence in Chicago, and has worked a great deal in Afghanistan. Is just back from a trip to Kabul, as a matter of fact. Was talking about it on Democracy Now! This morning. She points out that there is a ceasefire in Afghanistan for the holy month of Ramadan, the Islamic festival, the Islamic month. The Afghan president, the president of Afghanistan, installed, of course, with American assistance, to put no finer point on it, announced an unconditional ceasefire with the Taliban to last till the 20th of June. It's not all clear that he cleared this with D.C., but and suggests some other independent political movements that may be going on around the world, to the dismay of Foggy Bottom. But the ceasefire is obviously important. It comes after Muslim clerics in Afghanistan issued a fatwa. Fatwa is a religious ruling against suicide bombing, after an attack Monday claimed by ISIS, the remnants of the ISIS movement, killed 14 people who had gathered for a clerics peace summit in Kabul. What's happening is the ceasefire in Afghanistan is encouraged by the Muslim clergy and opposed by ISIS, but the real opposition to the ceasefire comes from the United States. The BBC just reported that the number of bombs dropped by the U.S. Air Force has surged dramatically since President Trump announced his Afghanistan strategy and committed more troops to the conflict last August. New rules of engagement, as they say in the Pentagon, have made it easier for U.S. forces to carry out strikes against the Taliban, in other words, to kill people in Afghanistan. Kathy Kelly is talking about, on Democracy Now! Today, the possibility that this independent ceasefire arranged by the Afghan parties is certainly a step in the right direction, but also an occasion for the U.S. peace movement to demand the U.S. military cease its operation in Afghanistan, which go back to the invasion of 2001. This is extremely important, and it's an opening, a chance, a possibility that we should take. Write and call your congressional representatives and say, we need to withdraw American troops from Afghanistan. The killing has gone on long enough. There is no excuse for it.
But that would give according to Mark Thiessen, that would mean that Google wouldn't be able to help develop drones and computer programs in order to make sure that we only kill the bad guys as opposed to too many innocent people.
Exactly. Too many. Just enough innocent people are supposed to be killed.
It's really unbelievable what was said in that column this morning. But
you've been watching News from Neptune for the 23rd week of 2018, presented by Carl Estabrook and David Green, produced and directed by Jason Liggett and Ethan Young and Andrew Scollery. This has been a summer vacation edition. Not much of a vacation for people in Afghanistan, perhaps, even though a ceasefire has been declared. Our thanks to Research Director Dr. No, J.B. Nicholson, the third man on News from Neptune. Those notes are posted on the Facebook page for News from Neptune. Inshallah, next week, there will be a new edition of News from Neptune to remind you, in the words of Edward de Vere, what's past is prologue, what to come in yours and my discharge. In the meantime, confusion to our enemies, and a good night to you.